Welcome to Scary Tales in the Rain, where the rain whispers secrets of the unknown, and the darkness cradles your deepest fears. Tonight, let the soothing sound of rain and my voice guide you through a chilling tale, true, or so it said. Sit back, relax, and let yourself drift into the mystery of the night. The story begins with a calm, eerie description of a small, sleepy town where people speak in hushed tones about an abandoned house on Maple Street. Some claim it's been empty for decades, others say the house is never truly uninhabited. Strange lights, sounds, and shadows are seen in the windows, but no one has ever dared to investigate. A curious teenager named Jake, who's recently moved to town and hears the stories. He's skeptical but fascinated. Despite warnings from his new friends, he decides to spend the night at the house to prove there's nothing to the rumors. His description of the house is hauntingly atmospheric, with creaky floors, overgrown ivy, and the distant sound of whispers on the wind. As Jake enters the house, the atmosphere grows more intense, with every creak of the wooden floor sounding like a warning. He ventures deeper into the house, and strange occurrences begin: whispers, cold gusts of wind, and the unmistakable sound of footsteps following him. With each step, the tension increases. At one point, he finds a portrait on the wall of a family, their eyes unsettlingly lifelike. And hears a door slam behind him. He's not alone. He starts seeing strange flashes, disjointed images of a family living there, happy at first, then descending into sorrow. One night, the family was involved in a terrible fire, and only one child survived. The child, now believed to be the one haunting the house, never left. The longer Jake stays, the more the child's presence makes itself known. He feels watched, cold hands brush his neck, and a chilling voice calls his name in the darkness. As the night progresses, Jake begins to unravel the tragic history of the house, learning about the family's loss and the curse that has kept their spirits trapped there for decades. Things take a darker turn as Jake feels a powerful force pulling him toward the attic. The whispers grow louder, urging him to come closer. There, he discovers the truth: the child never survived the fire, and what haunts the house is not the innocent spirit he believed it to be. In the final moments of the story, Jake escapes the house, forever changed by the encounter. The storm outside is calm, but the air is thick with lingering fear. As he walks away from the house, the rain falls steadily, almost as if to wash away the memories of what he's just witnessed. Story 2: The small town of Pine Ridge had always seemed like a peaceful, almost idyllic place. The kind of town where everyone knew everyone, and the most exciting event was the annual Harvest Festival. But there was one house, on the farthest end of town, that no one dared to talk about. Not openly, at least. This house had been abandoned for as long as anyone could remember, a crumbling structure with broken windows and ivy creeping up the walls. The locals referred to it as the Whispering House because of the strange noises that seemed to come from within, especially when the wind was right. Some said it was the wind itself, howling through the cracks in the walls. Others said it was something more. I didn't believe in ghosts. I was the kind of person who needed proof. But, as with all things in life, the stories began to gnaw at my curiosity. One evening, after the rain had stopped, I found myself standing in front of that very house. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, leaving the sky a deep shade of purple. The air was thick with humidity, and a light fog had begun to roll in from the forest behind the house. As I stared up at the building, something about it felt wrong. It was as if the house was staring back at me, silently daring me to enter. I don't know what drew me to it. Maybe it was the thrill of uncovering a mystery, or perhaps it was something more. Whatever it was, I couldn't resist. I stepped forward. The moment my foot crossed the threshold, the temperature seemed to drop, and the air became heavier, almost suffocating. The house groaned as if it had been awakened from a long slumber. I hesitated but pushed forward. The floorboards creaked under my weight as I made my way through the entryway. In the dim light, I could just make out the outline of an old chandelier, its crystals reflecting what little light there was. The walls, once beautifully decorated, were now covered in mildew, the remnants of the past slowly being reclaimed by time. But it was the silence that struck me the most. There were no sounds of life, no animals scurrying in the walls, no hum of electricity. Just an oppressive quiet that seemed to press down on me. As I explored further into the house, the silence was broken by a whisper. It was faint at first, barely audible, like the rustling of paper. But as I stood still, it grew louder, a soft, unintelligible murmur. I froze, my heart racing. The whispering seemed to come from the walls themselves, seeping through the cracks like a dark secret, one that had been hidden for years. The air grew colder still. I moved cautiously toward the staircase. The whispers seemed to be calling me, urging me upward, but I hesitated. There was something about this house that made me feel watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and a sudden chill ran through my body. But the curiosity was too strong. I climbed the stairs. At the top of the staircase, I found myself in a narrow hallway, the walls lined with portraits of people I didn't recognize. Their eyes followed me as I moved past, making my skin crawl. The whispering grew louder, more urgent. I was drawn to a door at the end of the hall. It was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness beckoning me to enter. I pushed the door open, and the temperature plummeted. Inside was a large, dusty room, its furniture draped in white sheets. The only thing that seemed untouched by time was a large mirror hanging on the wall. It was framed in gold, its surface gleaming despite the layers of dust around it. But as I stepped closer, I noticed something strange. The reflection in the mirror didn't match the room I was standing in. In the mirror, the room was pristine, bright, with no dust, no decay. But the most unsettling part was the figure standing in the reflection. It was a woman, dressed in a white gown, her long black hair flowing around her face. Her eyes were wide, almost as if she was staring at me, pleading with me to leave. I blinked, and the reflection disappeared. I turned quickly, but there was nothing behind me, only the old furniture and the stillness of the room. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing. The whispering had turned into a soft, melodic hum, but now it was all around me, pressing in on me from every direction. I was trapped. The room felt smaller. The walls closing in. I ran toward the door, desperately trying to turn the knob, but it wouldn't budge. The humming grew louder, more frantic, and I could hear faint voices, like a group of people calling out, but I couldn't understand them. I could feel the presence of something, or someone, standing behind me. With one last effort, I threw myself against the door. It crashed open, and I stumbled out into the hallway. The air was thick, and the temperature was still freezing, but the whispering had stopped. I ran down the stairs, out of the house, and into the cool night air, my breath coming in sharp gasps. The house loomed behind me, silent once more. I didn't stop until I was far away, back at the safety of my home. The rain had started again, softly tapping against the windows. But that night, the whispering didn't stop. I could hear it, faintly, from outside my window. And every night since, I've heard it, just barely, like a soft murmur on the wind, calling me, urging me to return. I don't know what it wants. But I know one thing for sure, it's not finished with me yet. Story 3, there's a place, hidden deep in the forest, where the trees grow so thick that no sunlight can ever break through. It's a place the locals whisper about, but never visit. A place called Blackwood Manor. It's been abandoned for decades, yet there are still those who swear they hear strange noises at night, footsteps, whispers, the creaking of doors opening and closing, as if the house were still alive, waiting for someone to return. I didn't believe in the stories at first. I was a skeptic, a person who needed to see things for myself before I could accept them. But when I found myself traveling through that part of the country for work, I couldn't resist. I had to see Blackwood Manor with my own eyes. And that decision would change everything. It was a rainy afternoon when I arrived at the manor. The sky was a thick gray, and the rain fell steadily, drenching the earth and turning the dirt roads to mud. The air smelled heavy, damp with the scent of wet leaves. As I approached the manor, I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. The house stood at the edge of the woods, its broken windows staring out like hollow eyes. The iron gate that once would have been grand now lay rusted and bent. A large, cracked sign hung from a chain by the gate, barely legible, but I could make out the words, Blackwood Manor. I should have turned back. There was something about that place that made my skin crawl. But my curiosity kept me going. The front door was ajar, creaking in the wind as if inviting me inside. I stepped through the threshold and immediately felt the temperature drop, like stepping into an old tomb. The air inside was thick, musty, as though the house had been closed up for years, suffocating under layers of dust and time. I hesitated for a moment, but the door behind me slammed shut, and the sound echoed through the empty halls. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. The silence was deafening. I called out, "Hello? Is anyone here?" But all I heard was the sound of my own voice bouncing off the walls. I began to move deeper into the house. The floorboards creaked beneath my feet, and the walls groaned as if they were protesting my intrusion. I could hear a faint sound, like whispering, carried on the wind through the cracked windows. But no matter how hard I listened, I couldn't make out the words. It felt like the house itself was trying to speak, trying to tell me something. But what? I reached what appeared to be the living room, a grand space once filled with luxury. Now, it was just a hollow shell, with broken furniture and shattered glass strewn across the floor. Yet, there was something off about it. The fireplace, though covered in dust and cobwebs, still looked oddly intact. It was as if it had been used recently, despite the years of neglect. I walked over to it, and my eyes caught something small, glinting in the dim light. It was a locket, half buried in the ashes. I picked it up, and as my fingers brushed the cold metal, a chill ran through me. I opened it, and inside, I found a picture of a woman. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and dark, as if frozen in a moment of terror. I felt an overwhelming sense of dread, but I couldn't pull myself away. As I gazed at the photo, the whispers grew louder. I turned, but the room seemed different now. The shadows were deeper, stretching toward me, as if they were alive. I felt the temperature drop even further. The whispers began to form words, low and soft at first, then rising to a frantic, desperate tone. "Leave, leave now, before it's too late." The voice, if you could even call it a voice, seemed to come from all directions. It wasn't human. It felt like something ancient, something that had been buried deep within these walls for far too long. I dropped the locket, my heart pounding in my chest, and backed away toward the door. But the door wouldn't open. I tried, pulling with all my strength, but the handle wouldn't budge. I was trapped. The whispers turned to cries, mournful, tortured sounds that echoed through the house. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, growing louder, closer. I spun around, but there was nothing there. And then, I saw her, the woman from the locket. She stood at the far end of the room. Her face pale and twisted in agony. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, staring directly at me. She was wearing a torn white dress, her hair hanging in matted strands around her face. And then, she moved, slowly at first, dragging her feet across the floor, the sounds of her footsteps scraping against the wood. The whispers intensified, and I could feel the weight of her presence pressing down on me. She was coming closer, her hands outstretched as though she were reaching for me. I stumbled backward, my heart racing. "Please, no," I whispered, though I knew it wouldn't help. She was already there, standing just inches from me, her cold breath on my face. Her lips parted, and a voice, a whispering, raspy voice, filled the room. Help me, they're still here." Before I could respond, the door suddenly swung open. I didn't hesitate. I ran out of that house faster than I had ever run in my life, not looking back, not even for a second. I reached my car, slammed the door, and drove away, the engine roaring to life as I left Blackwood Manor behind. But even now, years later, I can still hear the whispers. They follow me at night, when the wind howls through the trees. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still see her face, pale and twisted, pleading for help. But I know, deep down, that there is no escaping Blackwood Manor. Story 4. It was a quiet evening when I first stumbled upon the old antique shop. It wasn't a place I had planned to visit, but as I walked down the cobblestone streets of the small town, a strange pull led me to the dusty, unmarked door. The windows were fogged, and the dim light inside seemed to beckon me. I hesitated for a moment. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and mothballs, the shelves lined with trinkets and forgotten treasures. There was something eerie about the place, as if every object held a secret, a history long buried. My eyes drifted over the shelves, and that's when I saw it, a large, ornate mirror. Its frame was made of dark, intricately carved wood, worn by age. But what struck, it was me, of course, but not quite. The person in the mirror didn't look like I did in real life. Her hair was longer, her expression colder, and her eyes, they were full of sadness, as though she had seen things I could never imagine. For a brief moment, I thought it was just a trick of the light, or maybe my imagination running wild, but when I moved, the reflection I stepped closer to the mirror, heart pounding in my chest, and the reflection of me inched closer to the surface as well. The longer I stared, the more the woman in the mirror seemed to grow. More real. The reflection, help me, she whispered, her voice soft and mournful, yet I jerked my hand back. And in an instant, she disappeared, her reflection fading into nothingness. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in short gasps. Boo, the shopkeeper, an old man with sharp eyes and a weathered face, had appeared silently behind me. You've seen her, haven't you? He asked, his voice low and gravelly. I didn't answer right away, still trying to make sense of what I had just experienced. Who was she? I finally managed to ask. The man's gaze grew distant, as though remembering something painful. She was the previous owner of that mirror. A woman who made a deal with something she didn't understand. The mirror trapped her, and now, it takes anyone who dares to look too closely. A chill ran through me as I realized what he was saying. That woman in the reflection, she wasn't just a figment of my imagination. She was real. She had been trapped in the mirror for years, maybe decades, and now she had tried to reach out to me. I didn't know whether I was meant to help her or if she wanted to take me with her. I turned to leave, but as I stepped toward the door, I caught a glimpse of my own reflection in a glass display case. It was faint, almost imperceptible at first, but there it was, the woman, standing behind me, her cold eyes locked onto mine. And she wasn't smiling anymore. I ran from the shop, not looking back, my footsteps echoing in the empty street. The memory of her face still haunts me, and sometimes, when I pass by mirrors, I catch a fleeting glimpse of her reflection in the corner of my eye. I know now that she's always watching, waiting, for the next person who dares to look too closely. Story 5. It was a quiet afternoon when I found myself in a small, remote village. The sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the fields. The village was old, with stone houses and narrow, winding streets. But what caught my attention the most was the large forest that bordered the village, known by the locals as the Whispering Woods. The villagers spoke of the forest with a mixture of reverence and fear. They said that at dusk, the trees whispered to one another in voices that could be heard if you listened closely. It wasn't just the wind, they claimed. There were spirits in the woods, spirits of those who had been lost to the forest over the years. But one story stood out above the rest, the tale of a family who had disappeared in the woods decades ago, and whose voices still lingered. I wasn't sure what to make of these stories, but something about them tugged at my curiosity. So, as night began to fall, I made my way toward the edge of the forest. The air grew colder as I approached, and the once silent trees seemed to come alive with soft, murmuring whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but as I ventured deeper, I could hear distinct voices, like faint echoes calling out from the shadows. The deeper I went, the stronger the feeling of being watched became. The whispers grew louder, and I could hear words, snippets of sentences that seemed familiar, yet distorted. "Help us." One voice whispered. "We're lost." Another cried. I felt an overwhelming sense of sadness wash over me, and a chill ran down my spine. Suddenly, the forest grew still, unnervingly still. The whispers stopped, leaving only silence in their wake. But then, from behind a large oak tree, I saw them. A family of figures, faint, translucent, but undeniably there. They were standing in a clearing, looking lost and hopeless. The father, mother, and two children stood huddled together, their eyes wide with fear, as if they had been waiting for someone to find them. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the weight of their sadness, their longing to be free from whatever held them here. I knew in that moment that these spirits were trapped, unable to move on, and then, I understood. The spirits were not just lost in the physical sense, but in a spiritual one. They had died in the forest long ago, their souls unable to leave because they had never been properly laid to rest. Their spirits had been left wandering, caught in the echoes of their own fear and confusion. As I stood before them, I knew what I had to do. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, centering myself. In my mind, I reached out to them, offering a prayer, a ritual I had learned to guide lost spirits. "You are not lost," I whispered, "you are loved, and your journey is not over. Let go of your fear and follow the light that will guide you home." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, slowly, the spirits began to fade, their figures becoming less and less distinct. The father reached out, his hand trembling, and whispered, "Thank you." The mother and children nodded, their faces softening with relief. They began to disappear into the night, their forms dissolving like mist, leaving only the quiet whisper of the wind behind them. I stood there for a few moments longer, feeling the warmth of their gratitude and the peace that now surrounded the forest. The trees were silent, no longer whispering, as if they, too, had been released from the burden of the trapped spirits. As I left the woods, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The forest had been peaceful once again, and the spirits had found their way to the other side. Story 6. The town of Black Hollow was known for two things: its haunting beauty and its unsettling silence. Nestled deep in a valley, surrounded by dark hills and dense forests, the town had an air of mystery that both invited curiosity and repelled it. Locals rarely spoke to outsiders, and the few who did always mentioned one thing in hushed tones: the lantern of Black Hollow. The story of the lantern went back generations. It was said that, long ago, a young woman named Clara had vanished from the village under strange circumstances. Her family, desperate to find her, searched the surrounding woods for days but found nothing. It wasn't until a week later that a lantern appeared at the edge of the forest, glowing faintly in the distance. The light swayed gently in the breeze, but no one ever saw the person carrying it. The villagers, both curious and frightened, followed the light into the woods. But as they ventured deeper, the lantern would always vanish, leading them to new places, deeper into the darkness. The search for Clara had turned into a futile chase. Eventually, the lantern was forgotten, as was the young woman, but the light never disappeared. It continued to appear from time to time, leading lost travelers into the woods, where they would become disoriented, hopelessly wandering until they, too, vanished. Over time, the town began to whisper of the lantern's curse, and many came to believe that Clara's spirit had never truly left. Her restless soul roamed the woods, forever holding the lantern, leading others into the same fate. It was on a chilly autumn evening that I arrived in Black Hollow, hoping to uncover the truth behind the mysterious light. I had heard of it from an old friend who grew up there, and my curiosity had finally gotten the better of me. I stayed at the old inn near the village square, where the innkeeper's face was pale and her eyes always darted nervously when the lantern was mentioned. "Do yourself a favor," she said when I asked about the stories, "don't follow the light. If it calls to you, run." don't even look back. But I couldn't resist. That night, after the last of the evening fog had settled in, I ventured out to the edge of the forest, just as the first stars began to twinkle in the sky. And there, amidst the stillness of the woods, I saw it, the faint glow of a lantern flickering in the distance. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, but as I took a step closer, the lantern swayed gently in the wind, casting a soft, golden glow. The forest seemed unusually quiet, the only sound the rustle of leaves underfoot. I couldn't explain it, but the light drew me in. Urging me forward, I followed the lantern, pushing through the dense underbrush, the beam never flickering too far out of sight. The deeper I went, the darker the forest became, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long. It felt as though the trees themselves were watching me. And then, after what felt like hours, the light stopped. Standing before me was a figure, a woman, her face pale, her clothes tattered. She stood motionless, holding the lantern, the light illuminating her sorrowful expression. It was Clara. Her eyes were wide with an eternal sadness, and her lips moved, but no words came out. I froze, my breath caught in my throat, and the forest around me seemed to close in. But despite the fear creeping through me, I could feel the pull to approach, to understand what had kept her here all these years. As I stepped closer, her lips parted, and in a voice so faint I could barely hear it, she whispered, "Help me." I knelt before her, my heart aching for the soul trapped in the woods for so long. I knew, then, that Clara was not an evil spirit, but one lost in time, unable to move on because of the grief that had bound her to the forest. Her spirit was trapped in an endless loop, forever searching for those who could guide her home. In that moment, I understood what needed to be done. I reached out and touched the lantern, its warmth seeping into my palm. Closing my eyes, I began to speak softly, offering a prayer of release, one I had learned over years of working with spirits. "Clara, your pain is known. You are not alone. You no longer need to carry this lantern, for the path to peace is before you. Let go of your sorrow and move into the light, where you can finally rest. It is time to go home." For a long while, nothing happened. But slowly, the lantern's light dimmed, and Clara's form began to fade, her features softening, her sorrow lifting. She gave me one last, gentle smile before she vanished into the forest's mist. The light of the lantern fading away with her, the forest, once thick with the weight of her grief, now seemed lighter, calmer, as if the very air had changed. I stood there for a few moments longer, feeling the peace settle around me, before making my way back to the village. That was the last time I saw the lantern of Black Hollow. In my years of spiritual work, I have come to understand that many restless souls are not angry or malevolent. They are simply lost, caught in the weight of their own unresolved grief or unfinished business. Clara's soul had wandered for years, unable to find peace because no one had ever heard her cry for help. By acknowledging her sorrow and offering her the release she so desperately needed, I was able to guide her to the other side. If you ever find yourself in a place like Black Hollow, remember, not all spirits seek to harm. Some only need to be seen and understood. When you hear their whispers, when you feel their presence, listen carefully. You may be the one they've been waiting for to help them find their way home. Story 7. The small town of Maple Ridge was known for its rolling hills, quiet streets, and, oddly enough, its abandoned church. The church, once the heart of the town, had stood empty for decades. Its steeple was cracked, its windows broken, and the doors creaked eerily when the wind blew through. Despite its dilapidated state, there was an aura of reverence around the building, as if it still held something important within its walls. I first heard of the church during a visit to the local diner. The older folks, the ones who had lived in Maple Ridge their entire lives, often spoke of strange occurrences that had happened near the church, especially on certain nights. They said it was haunted by the spirits of those who had passed, unable to move on because of something that had happened long ago. Some even claimed that the veil between the living and the dead was thinned there, allowing the spirits to reach out to the living. I didn't believe it at first. Ghost stories are often exaggerated, I thought. But the stories were persistent, and eventually, my curiosity got the better of me. One evening, after the sun had set and the town had fallen into a quiet lull, I made my way to the church, drawn by the strange energy that seemed to linger in the air. As I approached, I could see the church's silhouette against the pale moonlight, its form casting a long shadow across the graveyard that surrounded it. The wind howled, and the trees rustled, but there was something unsettling about the silence that followed. It felt as if the entire world was holding its breath. I stepped inside the church. The air was thick with dust, and the floor creaked under my weight. But it was the feeling of being watched that unnerved me the most. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end as I walked further into the main hall. There, at the altar, I saw her. A woman, dressed in an old-fashioned gown, was kneeling in prayer. Her back was to me, but there was an ethereal quality to her presence that made my heart race. She didn't seem to notice me, or perhaps she couldn't. Her form shimmered faintly, as if she was both there and not there at the same time. I called out to her, but she didn't respond. Instead, she continued to kneel, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. I moved closer, my footsteps echoing in the empty church, and I could feel the weight of her sadness in the air around her. It was as if she were trapped in time, unable to break free from a moment in her past. Are you lost? I asked softly, though I wasn't sure why. The words seemed to come from somewhere deep within me, as if I already knew what she needed to hear. The woman turned slowly, and I gasped. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow with sorrow. She looked at me with a pleading expression, and then she spoke in a voice so faint I could barely hear her. I cannot leave, she whispered. I am bound to this place. I died here, but I never received my last rites. I cannot move on. Please. Help me. I was stunned. I had heard of spirits who couldn't move on due to unfinished business, but this was different. She wasn't angry or vengeful, she was simply lost, trapped in a moment of time, unable to escape the pain of her past. Her name, she told me, was Mary. She had been the wife of the church's pastor many years ago, but she had died under mysterious circumstances before she could be properly laid to rest. The church, once a place of solace, had become a prison for her spirit. She was bound to it, unable to leave because the rites had not been performed to free her. I need to be forgiven, she said, her voice trembling. I need peace, but I cannot find it here. I have waited so long. I understood then what I needed to do. Mary's spirit was trapped because of the guilt she carried, not for her actions, but for the life she was unable to live. She was stuck in an emotional prison, unable to move on because of an incomplete ritual, one that would have given her peace and allowed her spirit to ascend. And I, in this moment, was the key. I closed my eyes and said a prayer for her, a prayer for release. I spoke words of forgiveness, not only for her but for herself. I asked the universe, the spirits, the divine, to guide her home, to lift the burden of guilt that had held her in this church for so long. I called upon the light to surround her, to lead her out of the darkness. And then, as I spoke the final words of the prayer, something shifted. The temperature in the room changed, and a warm, golden light enveloped Mary. She looked at me one last time, her face softening, a look of gratitude washing over her features. Thank you, she whispered. I am free now. With that, her figure slowly began to fade, her form dissolving into the light. The church, which had once felt heavy with sorrow, now felt peaceful, as if a weight had been lifted. The air was still, and the silence that followed was one of calm and serenity. As I left the church, I glanced back one last time. The moon had risen higher, and the church, now bathed in its soft glow, seemed less ominous. The veil between the worlds, I realized, was not always a barrier. Sometimes, it was just a passage, a way for the lost to find their way home. Story 8, Cedar Hill had always been a quiet town, known for its picturesque landscape, with rows of trees that swayed in the breeze and homes that were passed down from generation to generation. But there was one house on the outskirts of town, an old Victorian mansion, that locals avoided. It was an imposing structure, its tall windows dark and uninviting, its paint peeling in the harsh winds. They called it the cursed house, for it was believed to be haunted by the spirit of a child who had tragically died there many years ago. The tale of the child was one that had been passed down for decades. A little girl, Lily, had lived in the house with her parents. Lily was known for her curious nature and her love for exploring the woods that surrounded the mansion. But one stormy night, Lily vanished without a trace. Her parents, frantic with worry, searched the woods for days but never found her. Eventually, they were forced to accept that their daughter was gone. Years passed, but the town stories of Lily didn't fade. People said that her laughter could still be heard on windy nights, echoing through the empty halls of the mansion. Others claimed to see her silhouette in the windows, standing there, waiting. It became clear that her spirit was restless, unable to move on from the place she had once called home. One evening, after hearing the story from a local, I found myself standing before the mansion. The air was thick with mist, and the trees around the house seemed to stretch toward the sky like skeletal hands. The house loomed before me, its windows dark, like the hollow eyes of something lost. I had come to Maple Ridge to learn more about the paranormal, to study the spirits that wandered in places like this. I wasn't sure what to expect, but the feeling of being watched as I stood outside the mansion was overwhelming. I hesitated for a moment, but then, curiosity pushed me forward. I stepped onto the creaky porch and turned the doorknob. To my surprise, the door creaked open, and I was met with an overwhelming stillness. The mansion seemed to breathe in the silence, its grand staircase and dusty furniture trapped in time. The air smelled of old wood and dust, and there was a coldness that seemed to seep through the walls. I walked deeper into the house, drawn by a sense of unease. The longer I stayed inside, the more I could feel the presence of someone, watching me. I moved cautiously, trying to avoid the creaking floorboards that might alert whatever spirit lingered here. That's when I heard it. A soft giggle, distant but distinct, like the sound of a child at play. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. And I froze in place. The giggling grew louder, and then, the faint sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway. I turned toward the sound, and at the far end of the corridor, I saw her. A little girl, no older than 7, wearing a faded dress, her long hair falling over her face. She stood still, staring at me with eyes that seemed too large for her small face. "Lily?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The girl didn't respond. She simply stared at me, her gaze empty, her expression unreadable. I knew instinctively that this was the spirit that haunted the house, the restless child who had never been able to move on. "Why are you here?" I asked softly, taking a tentative step forward. "What is it that you need?" Her lips parted, but no sound came. Instead, her tiny hand lifted, pointing toward the back of the house. I followed her gaze and saw the door to a room at the end of the hallway, slightly ajar. I walked toward the door, my heart racing. As I entered the room, I was struck by how much it felt like it belonged to a child. There were old toys scattered across the floor, a dollhouse in one corner, and a small bed covered in dust. But what caught my eye was the picture on the wall, a family portrait of Lily and her parents. In the portrait, Lily was smiling, her eyes full of life. But something about the image was wrong. The parents stood rigidly, their faces blank, as if they were mere shadows. I turned to find Lily standing behind me, her eyes still locked onto mine. It was then that I understood the tragedy that had befallen her. Lily had died in this room, left alone in the storm that had claimed her life. But more than that, her parents, who had never forgiven themselves for her death, had never mourned her properly. They were consumed with guilt and sorrow, unable to move on. And as a result, their spirits remained trapped here, alongside Lily's. "Lily," I said softly, kneeling in front of her, "your parents are still here, aren't they? They haven't left, because they never forgave themselves." She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Her small form trembled, as though she were carrying the weight of her parents' unresolved grief. I knew what I had to do. I reached out and gently took her hand, offering her warmth and comfort. "It's time for you to let go," I said. "Your parents are waiting for you to forgive them, and they need you to move on so they can find peace, too." Lily's form flickered for a moment, her image wavering like a mirage in the air. I closed my eyes and began to speak softly, offering a prayer for forgiveness, for Lily, for her parents, and for their troubled souls. I asked the spirits to find healing, to release the pain and guilt that had bound them to this house. "May you all find peace, and may your souls be free," I whispered. When I opened my eyes, Lily was smiling, a bright, peaceful smile that I had never seen on her face before. Her form began to dissolve, her image fading into the light. And as she vanished, the coldness in the room lifted, replaced by a warm, gentle calm. The mansion, once thick with sorrow, was now silent, still, and peaceful. The weight that had hung in the air for so long was gone. As I left the house, I looked back one last time. The mansion, though old and weathered, now seemed to stand with a quiet dignity. The spirits had found their peace, and so had the town of Cedar Hill. Story 9. It started on a quiet stretch of highway outside a small desert town. The road was endless, flanked by barren land and the occasional tumbleweed. I was driving home after a long day, the hum of the engine and the rhythm of the tires on the pavement the only sounds accompanying me. The night was cool, the stars bright against the dark sky, but something about the silence felt oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The first sign came when I glanced in the rearview mirror. At first, it seemed like a trick of the light, a shadow in the back seat, faint and shifting. But as I drove, it grew clearer. A figure sat there, still and silent, barely discernible in the dim interior. I pulled the car to the side of the road, heart pounding, and turned around, expecting to see nothing but empty seats. But the figure remained. A young woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes that stared straight ahead. She wasn't looking at me, she seemed to be staring at something far beyond the windshield. Who are you?" I stammered. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. The air grew colder, the windows fogging slightly despite the warm desert air outside. Her expression was blank, almost detached, but her presence carried a weight of sorrow so profound it was suffocating. I reached out tentatively, but my hand passed through her form as if she were made of mist. She didn't react. Taking a deep breath, I whispered, "If you need help, show me." Her head turned slowly toward me, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of emotion, a mixture of despair and urgency. She raised her hand and pointed to the road ahead. I hesitated, but the pull was undeniable. I started the car and resumed driving, the woman sitting silently behind me. She didn't move, didn't speak, but the air around her seemed to pulse with sadness. After about 20 minutes, she raised her hand again, pointing to a small dirt road that veered off the highway. I turned down the path, the tires crunching over gravel. The road led to a bridge, a narrow, rusted structure spanning a dried-out riverbed. I stopped the car and got out. The woman's figure was no longer in the back seat, but I could feel her presence all around me. I walked toward the bridge, the air growing colder with each step. As I reached the center of the bridge, I saw it, a battered car, half submerged in the mud below. It was old, rusted, and looked like it had been there for decades. The sight sent a chill down my spine. I climbed down carefully, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The car's windows were shattered, its doors bent inward. Inside, I saw the skeletal remains of a driver, her clothes tattered, her hair still clinging to the skull in brittle strands. It was her. A wave of sorrow crashed over me, and I felt her presence beside me again. This time, her face was clearer, and tears streamed down her ghostly cheeks. I realized then that she had been trapped here, her story untold, her life forgotten. "What happened to you?" I whispered. Images flooded my mind, brief, fragmented visions of her life. A road trip gone wrong. A sudden loss of control on the bridge. The car plunging into the riverbed. And then, silence. No one had come to find her. She had been alone here. Waiting for someone to notice, to care. "I see you," I said softly. "I'll make sure others do too." I called the authorities the next morning, reporting the wreck. They arrived, skeptical at first, but as the remains were unearthed and identified, the story of the young woman made the local news. Her name was Clara Hayes, a woman who had disappeared 40 years ago while driving home to visit her family. Her parents had passed on, but her surviving relatives were grateful to finally have closure. That night, as I sat alone in my car, I felt a warmth I hadn't expected. I turned to the back seat, and there she was again, but this time, she was smiling. Her form shimmered, her sorrow replaced with peace. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice soft but clear, before fading into the air. Story 10. Willow Creek was a quiet, forgotten corner of the countryside, where time seemed to stand still. The heart of the area was an old, decaying train station, abandoned for decades since the last locomotive steamed out of town. The tracks were rusted, overgrown with weeds, and the station itself was a ruin, its paint peeling and windows shattered. The locals avoided the place, and not just because of its desolation. They whispered stories about a watchman who had once worked there, a man named Thomas Grady. Thomas had been known for his dedication, working tirelessly to keep the station running smoothly. But one fateful night, tragedy struck. A passenger train had derailed on the tracks just outside the station, killing dozens. Thomas had been on duty, and though it wasn't his fault, the guilt consumed him. A few months later, he was found dead in the station's office, clutching the station's old signal lantern. Since then, people claimed his spirit never left. I first heard the story while staying with a friend in Willow Creek. As a spiritual medium, I'm often drawn to places like this, places heavy with untold pain. One chilly evening, armed with a flashlight and a sense of purpose, I decided to visit the old station. The building loomed against the twilight, its shadow stretching long over the tracks. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and rust, and the silence was broken only by the faint chirping of crickets. Inside, the station was eerily still. The wooden floor creaked under my steps, and cobwebs hung thick in the corners. I explored cautiously, my flashlight revealing abandoned ticket booths, overturned benches, and the remnants of forgotten luggage. As I approached the office, a sudden cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. I fumbled with the switch, but it wouldn't turn back on. Then, in the darkness, I saw it, a faint, flickering glow. Story 10. Willow Creek was a quiet, forgotten corner of the countryside, where time seemed to stand still. The heart of the area was an old, decaying train station, abandoned for decades since the last locomotive steamed out of town. The tracks were rusted, overgrown with weeds, and the station itself was a ruin, its paint peeling and windows shattered. The locals avoided the place, and not just because of its desolation. They whispered stories about a watchman who had once worked there, a man named Thomas Grady. Thomas had been known for his dedication, working tirelessly to keep the station running smoothly. But one fateful night, tragedy struck. A passenger train had derailed on the tracks just outside the station, killing dozens. Thomas had been on duty, and though it wasn't his fault, the guilt consumed him. A few months later, he was found dead in the station's office, clutching the station's old signal lantern. Since then, people claimed his spirit never left. I first heard the story while staying with a friend in Willow Creek. As a spiritual medium, I'm often drawn to places like this, places heavy with untold pain. One chilly evening, armed with a flashlight and a sense of purpose, I decided to visit the old station. The building loomed against the twilight, its shadow stretching long over the tracks. The air was heavy with the scent of damp wood and rust, and the silence was broken only by the faint chirping of crickets. Inside, the station was eerily still. The wooden floor creaked under my steps, and cobwebs hung thick in the corners. I explored cautiously, my flashlight revealing abandoned ticket booths, overturned benches, and the remnants of forgotten luggage. As I approached the office, a sudden cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing my flashlight. I fumbled with the switch, but it wouldn't turn back on. Then, In the darkness, I saw it, a faint, flickering glow. A woman stepped forward, her hand resting on his shoulder. "We never blamed you, Thomas," she said, her voice clear and gentle. "You did everything you could. It's time for you to let go." Thomas's grip on the lantern loosened, and tears glistened in his spectral eyes. "I've been so alone," he whispered. "I've waited for so long." "You're not alone anymore," the woman replied. The lantern's glow flared one last time before fading into darkness. Thomas stood, his form shimmering as he looked at the passengers surrounding him. Then, with a final glance at me, he gave a small, grateful nod before disappearing into the light with the others. The station felt different as I left that night, lighter. As if the weight of decades of sorrow had lifted, Thomas Grady's story reminds us that even in the afterlife, guilt and regret can hold a soul captive. But forgiveness, both from others and from ourselves, has the power to set us free. If you ever encounter a restless spirit, remember that offering understanding and compassion can be the key to helping them move on. Sometimes, all they need is to know they're not forgotten. Story 11. Deep in the forests of Louisiana lies a place the locals refuse to talk about. It doesn't appear on maps, and even those who've lived nearby for generations claim not to know its location. But if you stray too far from the main roads and follow the sound of faint, tinny music, you might stumble upon it, the Forgotten Carnival. I first heard about it from an old man at a diner. His words were cryptic, muttered between sips of coffee and nervous glances at the door. "It's cursed," he said. "Nobody goes there and comes back the same." Intrigued and skeptical, I decided to find it. As a spiritual medium, I've encountered restless spirits in haunted places, but this sounded different. I spent 2 days scouring the woods, guided only by the distant strains of calliope music. It was always faint, barely audible, but it never stopped. Finally, at dusk, I found it. The carnival lay in a clearing, hidden by a tangle of trees and undergrowth. Rusted rides stood frozen in time, a Ferris wheel, its cabins dangling precariously, a carousel, its horses cracked and faded, and a funhouse, its once bright paint peeling in long strips. The smell of decay hung heavy in the air, mingling with the faint scent of burnt sugar. As I stepped closer, the music grew louder. It didn't seem to come from a specific direction but rather surrounded me, filling the air like a mist. I passed a row of game booths. Their prizes still hanging, a grim collection of stuffed animals with glassy eyes and stitched-on smiles. One booth caught my attention, a shooting gallery. The targets, faded clowns and ducks, swayed slightly, as if in a breeze I couldn't feel. The moment I stepped up to the counter, the music stopped. A voice, low and gravelly, broke the silence. "Play a game." I froze. The booth was empty, but the voice was unmistakable. Before I could respond, the targets began to move, jerking and twitching as if they were alive. "No, thanks," I said, backing away. The voice laughed, a hollow, mocking sound. "They always say no at first." I turned and walked quickly toward the carousel. Its horses seemed to watch me as I approached, their painted eyes glinting in the dim light. One horse, larger than the others, had a twisted grin that sent a chill down my spine. "Ride with us," a voice whispered. This time, it was soft, almost pleading. The carousel groaned to life, the platform creaking as it began to turn. The horses moved up and down in jerky motions, their mouths opening and closing as if trying to speak. I stepped back, but the ground beneath me felt unsteady. The entire carnival seemed to shift and breathe, as though it were alive. The Ferris wheel turned slowly, its rusted gears screaming, and the funhouse doors swung open, revealing a dark, gaping maw. I had seen enough. This wasn't a simple haunting, it was something much darker, something that fed on fear and desperation. But as I turned to leave, the air grew heavy, and a figure appeared in the shadows. It was a man, or what had once been a man. He wore a tattered ringmaster's coat, his top hat tilted at an odd angle. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken and glowing faintly. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his voice smooth and menacing. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. You came here for a reason, he continued, stepping closer. You wanted to see the truth. Didn't you? Well, here it is. He gestured broadly, and suddenly, the carnival came alive. Lights flickered on, casting eerie shadows. Laughter rang out, high-pitched and distorted, along with the hum of voices and the clatter of rides, but there were no people. The sounds came from nowhere, filling the air with an overwhelming, chaotic energy. The ringmaster leaned in, his breath cold against my face. They're all here, you know. The ones who couldn't leave. They came looking for fun, for escape, but they found something else. Why? I managed to whisper. Because they wanted to stay, he said simply. And so they did. Forever. As he spoke, shadowy figures began to emerge, families, couples, children. Their forms were translucent, their faces twisted with fear and despair. They wandered the carnival, repeating the same motions over and over. A little girl reached for a balloon that wasn't there. A man stood frozen in front of the carousel, his hand outstretched toward a horse. You see, the ringmaster said, his grin widening, this isn't just a carnival. It's a trap. A mirror. It shows you what you desire most and then takes it from you. But you're different. You've seen beyond the veil. Maybe you can end it. I don't know what compelled me to act. Perhaps it was the sight of the trapped souls, their endless suffering. Perhaps it was the realization that if I stayed any longer, I'd become one of them. I focused my energy, reaching out to the spirits around me. You don't have to stay here, I said aloud, my voice steady. This place doesn't control you. You can leave. You can be free. The figures paused, their movements slowing. The air seemed to vibrate with tension, as if the carnival itself was resisting. No. The ringmaster roared, his form flickering. They belong to me. But the spirits began to fade, their forms dissolving into light. The rides groaned and creaked, the lights flickering wildly as the carnival fought to hold on to them. Finally, with a deafening roar, the entire place collapsed inward, as if sucked into a black hole. The ringmaster's scream echoed in the void before everything went silent. I found myself standing alone in the clearing. The carnival was gone, replaced by an empty field of grass and weeds. The music was gone, and the air was light and clear. To this day, I'm not sure what the forgotten carnival truly was, a gateway, a curse, or something else entirely. But I know this, some places are not meant to be found. And if you ever hear faint music in the woods, turn around. Don't follow it, because some things are better left forgotten. Story 12, it started with the fog. Thick, impenetrable, and wrong, I was traveling through Maine, the kind of backroads trip you take when you want to lose yourself in the quiet of the world. The towns I passed through were small, their buildings weathered by salt air and time. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the fog rolled in. It wasn't the usual coastal mist but something far denser. The road ahead disappeared in an instant, swallowed whole by a wall of white. I pulled over, thinking it was safer to wait it out, but the fog didn't feel like something that would lift. It felt alive. As I sat in the car, the silence pressed in. No crickets, no wind, just the muffled stillness of the fog. My headlights barely penetrated the murk, their beams swallowed a few feet ahead, and then I saw it. A shadow moved across the light, slow and deliberate. My heart leapt into my throat. It wasn't an animal, it was tall, humanoid, but wrong in some unnameable way. I told myself it was just my eyes playing tricks, but then it moved again, closer this time. The shadow became a figure, and the figure stopped just outside the edge of the light. It didn't step forward. It didn't retreat. It simply stood there, watching. I locked the doors and sat frozen, staring at the shape. My phone had no signal, and the idea of stepping out into the fog was unthinkable. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I could feel its gaze. Heavy and unyielding, then I heard it, a faint scraping sound, like nails dragging across metal. It came from behind me. I whipped around, but the rear window was just as fogged up as the front. The sound came again, louder this time, and I realized with growing dread that it wasn't coming from the car. It was coming from the roof. The figure outside the headlights began to move, stepping closer. As it entered the beam, I saw it clearly, or at least, I saw enough. Its limbs were long and unnaturally thin, its head tilted at an odd angle. Its skin was pale and stretched taut, as if it barely contained whatever was inside, and its eyes, if you could call them eyes, were sunken pits of darkness. The scraping on the roof grew louder, joined by another sound, a low, guttural growl. It reverberated through the car, making my chest feel tight. I threw the car into reverse, tires spinning against the gravel as I tried to escape. The fog was so dense I could barely see, but I didn't care. I had to get away. The figure in front of the car didn't move. It simply stood there, watching as I sped backward. The growling and scraping stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, I thought I was safe. Then I saw them, shapes emerging from the fog, dozens of them. They surrounded the car, their forms half hidden but unmistakably wrong. Their limbs moved with a jerky, puppet-like rhythm, and their heads turned unnaturally, all of them focused on me. I slammed on the brakes and sat frozen, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The figures didn't move closer. They just stood there, watching, as if waiting for something, and then I realized, they weren't watching me, they were watching the fog. The realization sent a new wave of terror through me. If these creatures were afraid of the fog, what could possibly be out there that was worse than them? As if in answer, the fog began to shift. A shape, massive and looming, moved through the white. I couldn't make out its form, but the sheer size of it was overwhelming. The figures around me began to retreat, disappearing into the mist one by one. Their movements were frantic, almost desperate, as they fled from the approaching shadow, and then it came closer. The car began to shake, the air vibrating with a low, otherworldly hum. I couldn't see it fully, just a towering mass of darkness within the fog. It had no distinct shape, only an overwhelming presence that filled the air with dread. I don't remember starting the car again, but somehow I was driving. The road was barely visible, but I didn't care. I just needed to get away. The hum grew louder, almost deafening, as the shadow pursued me. I could feel it, an oppressive force pressing down on my chest, making it hard to breathe, and then, just as suddenly as it began, the fog lifted, the road was clear, the air crisp and cold. I slammed on the brakes, pulling over to the side of the road. Behind me, the fog lingered at the edge of the forest, a solid wall of white. The hum was gone, and the oppressive weight had lifted, but I could still feel its presence, watching me from the other side. I never found out what the shadow in the fog was, or why it seemed to drive those creatures away. But one thing is certain, the fog isn't natural. It isn't safe, so if you're ever driving through the back roads of Maine and the fog rolls in, don't stop. Don't look, and whatever you do, don't let it catch you. Story 13, Lighthouses have always fascinated me. Their isolation, their purpose, their silent watch over the endless expanse of water. So, when I heard about the abandoned lighthouse at Blackstone Point, I couldn't resist the urge to investigate. The locals whispered about it, claiming it was cursed. The light hasn't shone for 50 years, an old fisherman told me. But sometimes you'll still see it, glowing faintly in the mist. I arrived at Blackstone Point late in the afternoon. The sun was low, casting long shadows across the rocky shore. The lighthouse stood tall against the darkening sky, its once white walls weathered and streaked with grime. The air was heavy with salt and decay. And the waves crashed against the rocks with relentless fury. As I approached the lighthouse, the wind seemed to carry whispers, not the kind born of imagination, but low, distinct murmurs that made my skin crawl. The door was ajar, creaking softly as the wind pushed it back and forth. I stepped inside, the scent of damp stone and rot overwhelming. The interior was dark, lit only by the faint glow of the setting sun filtering through cracked windows. The whispers grew louder. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the more I listened, the more I realized they were voices. Fragmented, overlapping, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once, I climbed the spiral staircase. Each step groaning under my weight. The air grew colder the higher I went, and the shadows seemed to press in closer. On the walls, strange markings had been scratched into the peeling paint. Symbols, spirals, and crude drawings of what looked like eyes. When I reached the top, I found the lantern room. It was empty, the massive lens shattered long ago. Glass fragments crunched beneath my boots as I stepped inside, and then I saw it. A figure stood in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was tall and impossibly thin, its form draped in shadows that seemed to writhe like living things. It turned to face me, and though it had no discernible features, I felt its gaze pierce through me. "What do you want?" I managed to ask, my voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, but the whispers grew deafening. Words formed within the chaos, words that didn't make sense, but carried a weight that felt ancient and malevolent. I stepped back, but the door slammed shut behind me, trapping me in the room. The figure moved closer, and with each step, the air grew colder, heavier. I reached for the charm I always carried, a small talisman blessed by a shaman during one of my past investigations. Holding it tightly, I began to recite a prayer for protection, my voice shaking but steady. The figure stopped, its form flickering like a dying flame. The whispers faltered, replaced by a low, guttural growl. "You cannot banish me," it said, its voice like the grinding of stone. "I am bound to this place, as they are bound to me." I glanced around and realized I wasn't alone. Figures began to emerge from the shadows, their forms translucent and pale. They were the lost, sailors, keepers, and wanderers who had been drawn to the lighthouse over the years, their souls trapped by whatever darkness inhabited this place. "What are you?" I demanded, gripping the talisman tighter. "I am hunger. I am despair. I am the void between the light and the dark." Its words filled me with a crushing sense of hopelessness, but I forced myself to focus. "You've taken enough," I said. "It's time to let them go." The shadow laughed, a sound that echoed through the room like breaking glass. "They belong to me. And soon, so will you." I closed my eyes, focusing on the talisman in my hand. I didn't know if it would work, but I had to try. I began to chant, calling upon the light to banish the darkness, to break the chains that bound the spirits. The shadow roared, its form twisting and writhing. The air vibrated with an unnatural force, and the lantern room seemed to pulse with energy. The spirits around me began to glow faintly, their forms growing clearer. They turned to face the shadow, their eyes filled with a quiet determination. Together, we stood against it. The light from the spirits grew brighter, illuminating the room in a blinding glow. The shadow shrieked, its form dissolving into tendrils of darkness that were consumed by the light. And then, it was gone. The lantern room was silent once more, the air warm and still. The spirits smiled at me, their expressions filled with gratitude. One by one, they faded, their forms dissolving into the light that now filled the room. As I descended the staircase, the whispers were gone, replaced by the soothing sound of the waves outside. When I stepped out into the night, the lighthouse was glowing faintly, its light cutting through the mist like a beacon of hope. The darkness was gone, but the memory of it lingered. Some places are born of shadows, and while we may banish them for a time, they always leave their mark. The lighthouse at Blackstone Point may shine again, but I know I'll never forget the shadow that once called it home. Story 14. In the remote part of a sleepy town, there stood a house on the outskirts, half buried by the dense forest that grew wild around it. The locals all knew about the house, but no one dared to go near it. They said it had been abandoned for decades, yet there was something about it that made even the bravest hesitate. No one ever truly explained why. The house was a dark, foreboding structure, its windows boarded up with rotting wood, the door barely hanging on its hinges. It was as if the house itself was trying to close itself off from the world. But still, there were rumors, always rumors, whispered behind closed doors. I had heard about the house from a passing traveler at a roadside diner. He was just a stranger passing through, but his words lingered in my mind long after he left. That place, he had said, his eyes darting nervously, it never stays empty. Not for long. People who stay there, they don't leave the same. I wasn't one to believe in such things, at least not until I saw the house with my own eyes. One chilly autumn evening, I decided to investigate, driven by an insatiable curiosity. Armed with my camera, recorder, and a notebook, I set off toward the woods. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the ground. The air was thick with the scent of damp leaves as I ventured deeper into the forest, and soon, the path grew narrower and the trees taller, their gnarled branches twisting into the sky like dark, skeletal hands. As the light dimmed, I found myself standing in front of the house. The structure was even more unnerving in the fading light, as if it were an ancient thing that had once been alive but now stood as a monument to its own decay. Despite its outward appearance, I felt a pull, something drawing me inside. I pushed open the rotting door, which creaked loudly in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust, and the floorboards groaned underfoot. The walls, once painted in some faded shade of blue, were now cracked and peeling. It felt as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting. I began to record, capturing the eerie silence that enveloped the place. There were no creaks or sounds of wildlife, just an unsettling stillness. As I made my way through the darkened hallways, I noticed something odd. The walls were lined with photographs, old, black and white pictures of families, their smiles frozen in time. But there was something wrong with the eyes in those pictures. They seemed to follow me as I moved. Their gazes unsettlingly alive. I stopped in front of one photo, a family standing together on the front porch of the house. The woman in the photo, dressed in a long white gown, had a twisted, unnatural smile. Her eyes, dark, hollow, locked with mine. A chill ran down my spine. I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper, soft at first, but growing louder, rising from somewhere deep within the house. At first, I couldn't make out the words. The voice was raspy, like someone choking on their own breath. But as I walked further into the house, the words became clearer. Come closer. It whispered. We're waiting. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end. I wasn't alone. I followed the sound, drawn toward the basement stairs at the far end of the hallway. The air around me grew colder, and the whispering grew louder, almost frantic. I could hear the faint sound of shuffling feet, like something was moving down there. Stepping cautiously down into the basement, my flashlight flickered. I cursed under my breath, tapping it against my hand. The beam barely illuminated the room before it went out completely, plunging me into darkness. Then, I felt it, a presence, something cold and heavy, standing behind me. My heart raced, and I spun around, but there was nothing there. Leave now. The voice urged again, its tone becoming sharper. Before it's too late. I turned on my recorder, hoping to capture something, anything, of what was happening. But the moment I did, the room seemed to pulse with a low, vibrating hum, like the walls themselves were alive. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from above, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone, or something, was walking through the rooms upstairs, moving closer and closer. I couldn't stay any longer. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my body refused to move. The whispering voices intensified, their calls growing louder, more desperate. Come closer. Come closer, and then, the door at the top of the stairs slammed open with such force that it rattled the walls. The air shifted, and I saw it, a figure standing in the doorway, half shadow, half human. It was a woman, her face pale and twisted in a grotesque smile. She reached out toward me with long, bony fingers. I ran. My feet pounded against the basement floor as I made my way back to the stairs. The house seemed to warp around me, the walls stretching and shifting like living things. I could hear the woman's footsteps following me, growing louder with each passing second, as I reached the front door. It slammed shut with an unearthly force. I pulled at the handle, my breath ragged. But no matter how hard I tried, it wouldn't budge. Behind me, the woman's voice echoed, low and menacing. You shouldn't have come. I couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Panic set in, and I yanked the door again, desperately pulling with all my strength. Finally, it gave way, and I stumbled out into the night, my heart racing. I ran, not daring to look back until I had reached the edge of the woods. Only then did I turn, catching my breath. The house stood there, dark and empty, its windows staring at me like hollow eyes. The whispers had stopped, but I knew they weren't gone. They were still in the air, waiting. Waiting for someone else. Someone like me, and as I left the forest behind, I swore I would never return to that house, because I knew deep down that the house at the edge of the woods was never truly empty. It was only waiting for the next person foolish enough to walk through its doors. Story 15, Greywood Manor had stood abandoned for as long as anyone could remember. Perched on a hill, its decaying stone walls and broken windows made it a haunting sight. Local legends whispered of the terrible events that had once taken place inside, and it was said that the souls of those who died within its walls could never rest, but I wasn't one to believe in mere rumors or ghost stories. As a paranormal investigator, I had encountered my fair share of haunted places, but none had intrigued me quite like Greywood Manor. I had heard rumors about the manor being cursed, but there was little information on what had truly happened there. And that's what drew me in, the mystery. I arrived one chilly evening in early November, the air thick with fog that clung to the ground like a living thing. The manor loomed ahead, dark and foreboding. Its once grand structure now appeared in ruins, its ivy-clad stone walls crumbling, the roof sagging under years of neglect. The very sight of it gave me an eerie sense of being watched, but I shrugged off the feeling. I had a job to do. As I crossed the overgrown grounds toward the front door, the silence around me felt unnatural. The wind didn't rustle the trees, and even the birds seemed to have abandoned the area. I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me. Despite the lack of sound, I felt as though the manor was alive with some unseen presence. The door creaked loudly as I pushed it open, revealing a dark and dusty interior. The air inside was thick with the scent of old wood and mildew. I flicked on my flashlight, its beam slicing through the darkness, illuminating the grand hallway. At one time, this must have been a beautiful home, but now it was a hollow shell of its former self. I began to move through the house, setting up my equipment as I went. The manor had a strange feeling to it, a sense of foreboding, but it was more than just the physical decay. There was something oppressive in the atmosphere, as if the house was burdened with a heavy secret. It didn't take long before I began to hear things, faint noises, whispers that seemed to float in from the walls. At first, I chalked it up to the house settling or the wind playing tricks, but the whispers grew louder, more distinct. I could hear them clearly now, even through the white noise of the equipment. Leave. Leave now. The voices murmured, their tone cold and pleading. I stopped in my tracks. My heart pounding. I knew that what I was hearing wasn't just a figment of my imagination. These were real voices, real spirits trapped in this house. But who were they? And why were they warning me to leave? I walked deeper into the manor, following the voices as they seemed to lead me toward the back of the house. I passed rooms filled with old furniture covered in sheets, their shapes distorted by the dim light. It felt as though the house had been abandoned in a hurry, as if the people who had once lived here had left without warning. The whispers guided me to a room at the very end of the hall. As I pushed open the door, the temperature dropped suddenly, the air turning ice cold. The room was large, its walls lined with shelves filled with old books, but what caught my eye was the painting hanging on the far wall. It depicted a woman, her face serene but her eyes filled with a deep sadness. I couldn't shake the feeling that her gaze was following me, even though the rest of her face remained frozen in a lifeless smile. I took a step forward, unable to take my eyes off the painting. That's when I heard it, a soft, sorrowful cry, faint but unmistakable. I turned around, and standing in the doorway was the woman from the painting. Her form was translucent, her face twisted in an expression of anguish. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice full of pain. I took a step back, my body frozen with fear. But I couldn't speak. I could only stare at her. She looked as if she were trying to reach out, but her hand remained locked at her side. Her form flickered, shifting in and out of focus, as if she were struggling to maintain her existence. She took a step forward, and the temperature in the room dropped even more. My breath was now visible in the air, each exhale a cloud of mist. The woman's eyes locked onto mine, and her voice cracked as she spoke again. "They're all trapped here. The souls. They can never leave." She whispered, her voice laced with an unbearable sorrow. "My family, we died in this house. And now, we are the forgotten." I reached out toward her, trying to understand what she was trying to tell me. But before I could speak, the room suddenly shook. The floor beneath me groaned as if the house were alive, and the painting on the wall began to bleed, dark red streaks running down the canvas. The whispers grew louder, now joined by anguished cries from unseen voices, each one begging for release. I stumbled backward, my pulse racing as I looked around for an escape. The woman's form began to distort, her figure twisting as though she were being pulled into the very walls of the manor. "They won't let me go," she whispered, her voice now barely audible, lost in the cacophony of the tortured souls surrounding me. "They're all waiting. Waiting for someone to help us." The air was thick with a terrible energy, the cries and whispers growing louder by the second. I knew I had to leave. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the creaking floorboards as I bolted for the door. Behind me, I could hear the sounds of something chasing me, something angry, something desperate. I didn't dare look back, knowing that if I did, I would never leave this house alive. I managed to escape, stumbling out into the cold night air. As I stood outside, gasping for breath, I could still hear the faintest whispers, calling my name, pleading for help. But I knew it was too late for them. The souls of Greywood Manor would never find peace. They were trapped, doomed to wander those decaying halls for eternity, waiting for someone else foolish enough to enter, and as I walked away from the house, I couldn't shake the feeling that the eyes of the woman were still watching me, forever haunting my every step. Story 16, it was an ordinary house, or at least it appeared to be. Nestled in a quiet neighborhood, surrounded by tall oaks and freshly manicured lawns, it was the kind of home you'd pass by without a second thought. I had moved into this house just a few months ago, eager for a fresh start after a long and exhausting period in my life. The house seemed perfect, a little old, but charming. And it was mine. At first, everything was fine. The creaking of the floorboards and the draft through the windows felt like cozy reminders that this place had history. The kind of history that made it feel welcoming. But over time, I began to notice strange things happening. At night, the house would hum. It wasn't a loud sound, more like a low, persistent vibration in the walls, a kind of murmur that I could feel in my bones. It was faint at first, easy to dismiss as the house settling or the pipes groaning. But the hum only grew louder with time, as though the house itself was alive. Then came the dreams. They were unlike any dreams I had ever experienced, realistic, vivid, and always set in the same house. In these dreams, I would walk through the halls, but they weren't the same. The walls would stretch and contract, and the windows would show nothing but darkness. There was always a feeling of someone, something, watching me. I could hear whispers, low and guttural, echoing from somewhere deep within the house. No matter how much I tried to run or escape, the house would change, trapping me inside, and the whispers would grow louder. The first night I woke up in a cold sweat, I brushed it off. It was just stress, I told myself. But when the dreams continued, night after night, I began to feel something shift. The house wasn't just haunted, it was actively trying to communicate with me. One night, after I had come home late from work, I noticed something different. As I stepped through the front door, I was hit with an overwhelming smell of dust and earth, like the smell of freshly dug soil. I turned on the light in the hallway, but the light flickered, and then went out completely. The hum I had grown accustomed to now felt almost like a heartbeat, thudding in the walls. Confused, I checked the fuse box. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Yet, the hum grew louder. I decided to investigate further, walking toward the basement door. It was the one place in the house I avoided, a dark, narrow staircase leading down into the depths of the house. I had never dared to venture down there, partly because it always felt wrong. But tonight, I felt compelled to see where the hum was coming from. The stairs groaned beneath my feet as I descended into the basement. It was cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of mold and rot. I fumbled around in the dark, reaching for the light switch, but the bulb didn't work. The hum was almost deafening now, vibrating through the floor beneath me. The closer I got to the far corner of the basement, the stronger it became. There, in the corner, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A crack in the floorboards. It wasn't large, but it was enough to make my heart race. The hum seemed to pulse from beneath it, almost as if something was trying to break free. I knelt down, placing my hand on the crack. The floor was warm. Too warm. The hum felt like it was reverberating in my chest now, a sensation that made me feel as though my very bones were vibrating. I had no choice. I pried up the floorboard, using the edge of a screwdriver I found nearby. Underneath the board was a small, hidden compartment. Inside, I found something wrapped in old, tattered cloth. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it, revealing a weathered, leather-bound journal. The moment I touched it, the hum stopped. I opened the journal, feeling the pages crumble beneath my fingers. It was written in a script I didn't recognize, and though I couldn't read the language, the symbols on the pages seemed almost alive. As I flipped through the pages, I came across one that made my blood run cold, a drawing of the very house I was standing in. The words beneath it read, "The house has a heart. And it is hungry." Suddenly, the house shook. The walls groaned, and I heard a deafening crash from upstairs. I rushed back up to find the living room completely destroyed, furniture overturned, windows shattered, the entire space in disarray. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was a figure, a shadow. Barely human, its shape constantly shifting, like smoke in the air. It hovered, its form flickering in and out of focus. The only thing I could make out was its eyes, black pits that seemed to draw in the light, a deep emptiness that stared into my soul. "Why are you here?" The figure whispered, its voice a distorted blend of thousands of voices, as though it was speaking from the depths of the house itself. I tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but no words came out. The figure reached out toward me, its cold fingers brushing against my cheek. The moment it touched me, I felt a sharp pain shoot through my chest, as though the house itself was trying to pull something from me. "The house has always been alive," the figure whispered, its voice fading as it melted into the shadows. "It feeds. It grows. And now, it wants you." I staggered back, gasping for air, the pain in my chest burning with every breath. I looked around, and for the first time, I realized, this house was more than just a home. It was a living, breathing entity, feeding off the lives of those who entered. And it had claimed me. I ran, but as I reached the door, I felt the walls closing in, the house tightening around me. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the entire structure. The hum returned, louder than ever, and I realized with a sickening certainty that there was no escape. The house had claimed me, and I was now part of its dark, endless hunger, and somewhere, deep within the house, I could hear the whispers of those who had come before me, lost souls, trapped in its dark embrace, waiting for the next person to fall into its grasp. As I stood there, unable to move, I understood the truth of the journal's words. The house had a heart, and it was still hungry. Story 17, The Walls of Hollow Creek. I had always been drawn to old houses. There was something about their history, their mystery, that made them irresistible. So when I found out that a property in Hollow Creek, an isolated town on the edge of the forest, had been left abandoned for decades, I couldn't resist. It was a large Victorian-style house, with a wraparound porch and towering windows that stared out over the dense woods. The perfect project. Or so I thought, when I first arrived, the house was everything I had imagined. Its grandeur was hidden beneath layers of dust, and vines crawled up the sides, but it was clear that it once had been a beautiful home. I could see the potential. The real estate agent had told me that no one had lived there for over 50 years, but that didn't bother me. I didn't believe in ghost stories or the rumors about the place. I just wanted to restore the house, bring it back to life. The first few days passed uneventfully. I spent my time cleaning, sorting through the old furniture that had been left behind, and trying to make the space more livable. The air was thick with the smell of old wood and decay, but that didn't faze me. I worked late into the night, determined to breathe new life into the forgotten place, but then things started to change. It began with small things that could easily be explained away. The creaking of floorboards when no one was there. The soft tapping on the walls that echoed through the hallways. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, but as the days wore on, the noises became more distinct. It wasn't just creaking anymore. It sounded like footsteps, slow, deliberate steps, following me from room to room. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just imagining things. But then one night, as I was walking through the living room, I heard a whisper, a voice, faint but clear, "Leave, before it's too late." I froze, my heart racing. I looked around, but there was no one in the room. The house was empty. I stood there for a long moment, trying to make sense of it, but nothing made sense. It wasn't just the whisper, the temperature in the room had dropped. The chill was unbearable, the kind that seeps into your bones and stays there. The next morning, I found something strange. The door to the basement, which I had never opened, was wide open. The lock was broken, and the door was ajar. I don't know why, but something compelled me to go down there. I had avoided the basement from the start. It felt wrong, even from the outside. But now, it felt like I had no choice. I took a flashlight and descended the narrow, creaky stairs. The basement was damp and cold, and it smelled of mold and earth. My footsteps echoed as I walked further in, the beam of the flashlight shaking in my hand. The basement was filled with old furniture, broken furniture, and piles of old newspapers. But then something caught my eye. In the far corner of the room, almost completely hidden by the shadows, was a wooden chest. It was old, much older than anything else in the basement. The chest was covered in dust and cobwebs, as if it hadn't been touched in decades. I don't know why, but I felt an overwhelming urge to open it. As I lifted the heavy lid, a cold gust of air rushed past me. Inside the chest was an assortment of old books, yellowed with age, and a stack of faded photographs. But what stood out was a small, intricately carved box. It seemed out of place, too delicate for the rest of the items. Without thinking, I picked it up. The moment my fingers touched the box, the house groaned, a deep, unnatural sound that reverberated through the walls. The whispering started again, louder this time, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. I dropped the box back into the chest, and the noise stopped abruptly, but I felt something shift in the air. The house had felt old before, but now it felt alive, as if it was aware of my presence. I rushed back upstairs, my heart pounding. But when I reached the main floor, everything had changed. The rooms were darker, the shadows seemed to stretch further, and the house felt heavier. The walls, once silent, now seemed to hum with energy, and I could hear faint whispers coming from all around me. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to get out. But as I tried to leave, I found the doors locked. The windows wouldn't open. I was trapped inside. The whispering grew louder, echoing through the house. And I realized with a cold jolt of terror that it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus, many voices, all speaking in unison, but none of them saying the same thing. They spoke of pain, of loss, of regret. And at the center of it all was one word: hollow. The temperature dropped again, and I heard the distinct sound of footsteps approaching. I turned around, and standing at the end of the hallway was a figure, faint, translucent, but unmistakable. It was a man, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, his face gaunt and pale. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to peer into my very soul. "You shouldn't have come," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You've awakened them." The house began to shake, the walls groaning as though they were being torn apart from within. The whispers turned to screams, and the air grew thick with the sound of 1,000 voices, all calling out in pain and terror. I turned to run, but the hallway stretched impossibly long, and I could hear the footsteps behind me, growing closer with each passing second. I finally reached the front door, but it wouldn't open. I turned around in desperation, and the figure was there again, now standing only a few feet away. He reached out toward me, his hand cold and clammy, but I couldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear. "You cannot leave," he said softly. "This house is ours now. And you are ours." Suddenly, the door flew open, and I bolted out into the yard. The moment I stepped outside, the whispers ceased, and the house fell silent. The temperature returned to normal, and the shadows seemed to retreat. But when I looked back at the house, I saw it clearly for the first time, not as a forgotten, abandoned property, but as it truly was, a dark, living entity, feeding off the souls of those who dared enter. I never returned to Hollow Creek after that night. I left the house behind, leaving it to its dark fate, but I knew that it wasn't over. The house would wait, patiently, for the next person to fall into its trap, and it would always remember the name of the town that had given it life, Hollow. Story 18, The Forgotten Room. When I moved into the old manor on the outskirts of town, I was thrilled. It was exactly what I had dreamed of, an ancient house full of character, with creaky floors and high ceilings. The kind of place that begged for stories to be told in its dark corners. I had always loved older homes, their mystery and history calling out to me. But I couldn't have known how deep that mystery ran in this one. The house had been empty for years, ever since the last owners had passed away under strange circumstances. Their sudden disappearance was never fully explained, and it was said that they had left the house in a hurry, leaving behind all their belongings. Most people in town had avoided the place, speaking of it only in hushed tones, but to me, that just added to its allure. I spent the first few weeks unpacking, cleaning, and slowly making the house feel like my own. I explored every inch, from the grand staircase in the foyer to the attic that had long been sealed off. But there was one room I couldn't bring myself to enter. It was the room at the end of the hall on the second floor. The door was slightly ajar, but it was as if the house itself was holding it closed. Every time I passed by, I could feel the air grow heavier, like something, or someone, was waiting behind the door. One evening, after a long day of work, I couldn't resist any longer. I had to see what was behind that door. I approached it with caution, my hand shaking as I touched the handle. The door creaked open, and I stepped inside. It was a small, dimly lit room, with no windows and only a single, bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. The walls were covered in peeling wallpaper, and dust hung thick in the air. But what stood out most was the strange feeling that enveloped the room. It felt wrong, as though the very air inside was different from the rest of the house. It felt heavy, suffocating, like the room was holding a secret. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror. It was framed in dark wood, intricately carved with patterns I couldn't quite make out. The glass was cloudy, but there was something about it that made me uneasy. I couldn't look away. Suddenly, I felt a cold breeze pass through the room, even though there were no open windows. I stepped closer to the mirror, and as I did, I saw something in the reflection that made my heart stop. The room behind me, everything around me, was completely different. The wallpaper was fresh, the furniture elegant, and the floor was polished, gleaming as though it had never seen the dust of time. But it wasn't just the room that was different. In the reflection, there was someone standing behind me, a woman, dressed in a long, flowing gown, her face hidden in the shadows. She was standing perfectly still, but I could feel her presence, as though she was watching me. I spun around, but no one was there. I turned back to the mirror, my breath shallow, and she was still there, staring at me with eyes I could not see. The reflection began to shift. Slowly, painfully, the woman raised her hand, and a cold, invisible force seemed to pull me closer to the mirror. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. The air felt thick and pressing, and the whisper of her voice filled my ears. It was faint at first, almost imperceptible. But then it grew clearer. "Leave this place," she said, her voice low and cold. "Leave, before it's too late." The air around me seemed to close in, and my vision blurred. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It felt as though the room itself was alive, suffocating me. I could see the woman's face more clearly now, pale, with hollow eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. Her lips curled into a sinister smile, and the reflection in the mirror started to distort. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening crash. I screamed, my pulse pounding in my ears, and I turned back to the mirror. The woman had moved. She was no longer standing still. She was reaching out, her long fingers stretching toward me. The glass rippled like water, and before I could react, the woman's hand shot through the mirror, grabbing my wrist with a grip that felt like ice. I tried to pull away, but her fingers dug deeper into my skin, sending a shock of freezing cold through my entire body. "Help me," I gasped, though I knew no one could hear me. Her cold, unblinking eyes never left mine. Then, slowly, she spoke again, her voice like ice scraping on metal. "Why did you come here?" With all the strength I could muster, I twisted free from her grip and staggered back toward the door. I yanked it open, and the moment I stepped into the hallway, everything stopped. The air cleared, the suffocating weight lifted, and the house felt normal again. But when I looked back at the door to the room, it was just a plain, empty space. There was no mirror, no ornate frame, and no woman. I couldn't explain it. My hands were trembling as I ran back to my bedroom, locking the door behind me. The night passed in a restless haze, but as I lay there, I kept hearing the soft whispers again, like echoes from the room. "Leave, leave before it's too late." The next morning, I couldn't bring myself to go near the room. The house was silent, but I could still feel that same weight pressing down on me whenever I passed by. I packed up my things, got in my car, and left Hollow Creek for good, but as I drove away, I glanced back at the house in my rearview mirror. For just a moment, I saw her again, the woman, standing behind the window on the second floor, and this time, she was smiling. Story 19, The House at Ravens Hill. I never believed in ghosts or spirits. At least, I didn't until I moved into the old house on Ravens Hill. It was one of those grand, looming mansions that looked like it belonged in a horror novel. The kind that had secrets hidden behind every cracked wall and forgotten attic. The kind of house that people in the town would point at when they passed by, speaking in whispers about the tragic history of the place. They said it was cursed. They said that the last family to live there had disappeared without a trace. No one knew what happened to them, and the house had remained empty for nearly 40 years. But I wasn't superstitious. I had always longed for a place with character. A home that spoke to me, and the price for the house was something I couldn't pass up. The moment I stepped through the front door, I could feel it. It wasn't the musty air or the damp floors. It was a presence. A weight in the room that made everything feel off. But I shrugged it off. After all, an old house would come with its quirks, right? The first few weeks were quiet enough. I went about cleaning and restoring the house, breathing new life into it. The wooden floors creaked under my feet, and the wallpaper was peeling in places, but it was nothing I couldn't fix. I even found old furniture tucked away in the attic, antique chairs and a large, ornate mirror that had been covered in dust and cobwebs. I decided to hang it above the mantel in the living room. It felt right. But that's when things started to happen. It began with strange noises. At first, it was just the house settling. The creaking of floorboards at night, doors gently swinging open, whispers of wind outside. But soon, the sounds grew more distinct. I would hear soft footsteps just behind me when I was in another room. Sometimes, when I was alone in the kitchen, would hear what sounded like faint laughter, just out of reach. I could never tell if it was real or if my mind was playing tricks on me, but one evening, everything changed. I was sitting in the living room, reading a book by the fireplace, when I heard a soft knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, but I went to answer it anyway. When I opened the door, there was no one there. Just the empty porch and the dense fog creeping across the yard. I shrugged it off and turned to head back inside, but as I reached for the door handle, I noticed something strange. The mirror that I had hung earlier had shifted. It wasn't in the same place it had been. It was now angled slightly to the right, as if someone had moved it. I thought I had been imagining it. But when I checked, I realized it was no illusion. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I turned to look at the reflection in the mirror, but the image staring back at me wasn't mine. It was the face of a woman, pale and gaunt, with hollow eyes staring at me, her lips barely moving. "Why did you come here?" Her voice whispered, barely audible, as though it was carried by the wind. I stepped back, my heart pounding in my chest, and the reflection in the mirror began to change. The woman's face twisted in agony, her expression one of torment. She opened her mouth and spoke again, this time with a voice full of sorrow. "Help me. Help all of us." The temperature in the room plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs as I backed away from the mirror. The room was freezing, and the shadows seemed to move, stretching across the walls as if alive. I could hear the whispers growing louder, a chorus of voices all speaking at once. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get out of there. But as I turned to leave, I found that the door was locked, the handle cold to the touch. I tried to turn it again, but it wouldn't budge. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but no one came. The whispers grew louder, now mixed with screams of agony. The mirror flickered, and in its reflection, I could see more faces, more people, their expressions contorted in pain and fear. They were trapped in the glass, their eyes pleading for release. Suddenly, a voice, strong and clear, broke through the noise. "You must leave this place before they come for you." I turned around to see a figure standing in the doorway, a man in his 40s, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, with a face lined with sorrow. He had a calm, reassuring presence, and something about him made me feel safer, as if he was someone who understood what was happening here. "I'm the one who was meant to help you," he said, his voice steady. "You must listen carefully. There is a curse on this house, and the souls of the family that lived here are trapped, unable to move on. They've been bound to the house for over 100 years. Every time a new person comes, they latch onto them, trying to claim them as their own." I could feel the walls closing in around me, and the whispers grew more frantic. The faces in the mirror pressed against the glass, their hands outstretched, begging for release. "You're not alone," the man continued. "There are others, many others, who have come here, who have tried to leave, but the house never lets them go. You are the only one who can free them. You have the power to release their spirits." I was shaking, but I could feel something stirring deep inside me, something that connected me to the house. The man stepped forward, his face full of compassion. "You need to perform a ritual, a prayer to release the spirits trapped here. You must speak their names, one by one, and tell them they are free. The mirror is the key. It's where their souls are bound. Once you speak the words, they will be able to move on." I nodded, my voice barely above a whisper, but the man smiled, his eyes full of hope. I turned to the mirror, taking a deep breath. The air felt thick, oppressive, but I spoke the words the man had taught me. I spoke the names of the spirits trapped in the house, each one breaking through the darkness that surrounded me. The temperature slowly began to rise, and the faces in the mirror began to fade, their expressions softening. When I finished, the room seemed to exhale. The weight lifted, the whispers faded, and the house itself seemed to breathe again, the air warmer, lighter, and just like that, the curse was broken. The man smiled at me one last time. "Thank you. You've done what was needed." Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he was gone, his form dissipating into the air like mist. The house felt silent, peaceful for the first time in years, I left Ravens Hill that night, knowing I had freed the trapped spirits. As I drove away, I looked back one last time at the house. It stood there, still and silent, but I knew it was no longer cursed, and as for you, the ones who are listening to this tale, know that sometimes, the spirits of the past are waiting for someone to help them move on. So if you ever find yourself in a house that feels alive, listen closely, for there may be someone there who needs your help. Story 20, The Campfire Curse. A few years ago, my friends and I decided to go camping in the mountains. We'd heard about a remote spot deep in the woods, far away from the usual crowds. It was a place known for its beauty, tall trees, flowing streams, and perfect spots to set up camp. It sounded ideal for a weekend getaway, so we packed up our gear, grabbed our flashlights, and set off on a Friday afternoon. We made the 2-hour drive to the trailhead, parked our car, and began the hike up into the mountains. The air was crisp, and the smell of pine trees filled our lungs. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves underfoot. It was peaceful. Almost too peaceful. We reached the campsite just as the sun was starting to dip below the horizon. The area was as beautiful as advertised, a small clearing surrounded by towering trees, with a gentle stream running nearby. We set up our tents, built a campfire, and started cooking some food, enjoying the silence of the wilderness. As night fell, the fire flickered and danced, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground. As we sat around the campfire, telling stories and joking around, one of my friends, Alex, brought up something strange he'd heard. He had read online that there was a local legend about the area, a story about a curse that haunted the woods. According to the legend, anyone who camped in the forest after dark would be visited by the spirits of lost travelers, those who had wandered too deep into the woods and never returned. The spirits were said to wander the forest forever, seeking someone to replace them, someone who would be lost like they were. At first, we laughed it off. The woods were beautiful, and we were in a safe, well-trodden area. There was no way we were in danger. But as the fire crackled and the night grew darker, a cold chill settled over us. I could tell that Alex was getting a little nervous. But we all just continued talking and trying to push away any uneasy feelings. We went to bed around midnight, each of us retreating to our tents. It was at that moment that something felt wrong. I couldn't put my finger on it, just a sense of being watched, a feeling that someone was lingering in the shadows just beyond the reach of the firelight. At around 2 a.m., I was suddenly jolted awake by a noise outside my tent. It wasn't the usual nighttime sounds of the forest, no rustling leaves, no chirping insects. This was something more deliberate, like footsteps crunching on the dry ground. My heart began to race. I strained my ears, listening for any sign that it was just an animal. But I heard nothing else. The footsteps stopped, and everything went eerily still. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent quietly. I stepped out into the cold night air, shining the light around the campsite. The fire had died down to a few smoldering embers, and the only sound was the wind through the trees. But then, just beyond the reach of the dim light, I saw something, a figure. It was just standing there, too far to make out any details. I froze. My mind screamed that it was probably just one of my friends, messing around, but something felt wrong about it. The figure didn't move, and I didn't hear anything else. I called out, my voice shaky, "Alex? Is that you?" No response. I stepped forward, and the figure remained still. As I got closer, I noticed something even more unsettling. The figure was wearing a tattered jacket and old boots, but it didn't look right. Its posture was unnaturally stiff, like it wasn't alive. The closer I got, the colder the air around it felt. Suddenly, a voice whispered from behind me, "Don't get any closer." I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. It was Alex, standing in the shadows, his face pale. "What are you doing?" I asked, bewildered. Alex was shaking his head. "You don't understand, it's not a person. It's one of them." "What are you talking about?" I whispered, panic rising in my throat. But Alex didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed my arm and pulled me back toward the tent. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural sound, like a growl, coming from the figure. My flashlight flickered and then went out entirely, plunging us into darkness. We rushed back to the tent, and Alex quickly zipped it up, locking the entrance. We huddled together in the dark, not saying a word. Outside, the footsteps began again. But now, they were all around us, circling the tent. Soft, shuffling movements, like someone, or something, was waiting, watching, just outside our thin walls. The air felt thicker, colder. Alex's voice broke the silence. There are more of them. They come every night. They're always looking for someone. We stayed silent, hearts pounding. Then, the whispers began. Faint at first, but then louder. You don't belong here. You'll be lost like us. The voices seemed to come from all directions. The temperature in the tent dropped. I could see my breath in the air, and the weight of the atmosphere pressed down on me. Every instinct screamed that we needed to leave, but I knew it was too late. Whatever these things were, they were not going to let us go. The whispers grew into a chorus of voices, each one more frantic than the last. Join us, they whispered, stay forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the voices stopped. The air grew warm again. The footsteps faded into the distance. I cautiously unzipped the tent and looked outside. The forest was quiet again, but the unease remained. The figure was gone, and the chill in the air had lifted, but I knew something was wrong. The curse, whatever it was, had not let us go. We didn't wait until dawn. Without a word, we packed up our gear and hiked back to the car, the oppressive silence of the forest pressing in around us. We never spoke about what happened that night, but none of us could shake the feeling that something had followed us out of those woods. If you ever go camping in the mountains, make sure you stay close to the trail. And if you hear the whispers in the dark, don't answer. You might just find yourself lost in the forest, wandering with the spirits forever. And so, as the night deepens and the shadows stretch long, remember, not all is as it seems. The world is full of secrets, and some of them might just be waiting for you when the darkness falls. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more haunting tales to guide you into a peaceful sleep, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Your support means the world to us, and it motivates us to share more chilling stories that will keep you intrigued and relaxed. Now, as you close your eyes, let the sound of the rain and the whispers of the unknown lull you into a deep, peaceful sleep. Sleep well, and remember, there's always a story to be told. Sweet dreams, and good night. Subscribe now, and let the next tale carry you into slumber.